Okay, in this final segment, let's wrap up with the most modern things in psychology. So like I said, we have been going through sort of stage by stage from structuralism into functionalism and then finally into behaviorism. I mentioned that Freud sort of spanned across the period from structuralism all the way into behaviorism. So he was sort of at the same time. Humanistic psychology was developed as really a reaction to Freud. Freud, we'll talk about this when we get to personality theory, and we'll talk about humanism as well. Freud was pretty negative on humans. He definitely thought that, we have unconscious motives and that mostly those motives are pretty dark. So the humanists came along, primarily Rogers and Maslow, but there are others. But they came along in the 1940s and into the 50s and talked about humans in a much more optimistic way. They really were focused in on our positive potential, our ability to do good things, and our instead of us having unconscious conflicts that are motivated by pretty dark instincts, they talked about us having a positive drive to become our best selves. They talked a lot about self-determination and that humans are happier when we feel like we get to determine our own outcomes, that humans are imparted with free will and that we have choices to make, and that it's important for us to feel like we've gotten to make choices, and that that kind of freedom allows us to become our best selves. They were definitely a reaction to the negative implications of Freud, like I said. But they were also a reaction to the behaviorists who talked about us being manipulatable by our environment. Like Watson taking his classical conditioning and using it in marketing. He really was confident that you can make people do stuff that they don't even necessarily want to do. And that's what behaviorists are all about, is the idea that environmental influences can cause us to do stuff that we don't even really want to do. And, of course, Freud said our unconscious instincts can make us do stuff that we don't really want to do. The humanists were really reacting to that and saying, we get to choose. We get to decide how we're going to act. And that maybe day to day and moment to moment we aren't consciously focused on every single little decision that we make, but that our life trajectory and things like that are influenced by our own choices and our own free will. So they talk about things like striving for self-actualization, striving to become our best selves, and that basically people are intrinsically good, and that given the freedom to be their best selves, people will be good. So you can kind of see Rogers and Maslow going, I don't like, and plus you got to remember this, they came on the scene in the late 40s and into the 50s. So they were also, I didn't list it on the slide, but also reacting to things that had gone on in World War II that make it seem like humanity is very negative. Right? So they were kind of reacting to that as well, trying to make the argument that, in their best state, humans are motivated by positive drives. Okay, the last school I was going to talk about is cognitive psychology, because it's sort of the most modern, recent development. In cognitive psychology, we study things like perception, which is how we make sense of the information that comes in through our eyes, our ears, our nose, things like that. It also talks about thoughts. Thoughts are cognitions. That's another word for thought, is cognition. So any thoughts that are going on in your head, memory, your ability to store information and retrieve it when you want to, and the reasoning. How do you solve problems? How do you make good decisions? Things like that. You can see that the cognitive psychology field is a return to the mental processes that Wundt had been trying to study. But now, instead of trying to figure out the most elemental bits that structuralism was trying to study, cognitive psychology is really interested in understanding it maybe from a more functionalist perspective. Really trying to understand how these different abilities help us to be, adaptive and do our, do the things we need to do as humans. Where we're going in the future, and where a lot of cognitive psychologists are studying right now, is the combination of psychology, which would be the cognitive side, and then more biology, which would be the study of neuroscience. So I'm hesitating for a second because I'm trying to think of, I've got a PhD in cognitive psychology. All of my friends who have graduated pretty much since I graduated don't have a PhD in cognitive psychology like I have. They have a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. It's really hard to do research in cognitive psychology without a nod to the brain. You know what I mean? And brain scans are important, or what are called evoked response potentials, or ERPs, which are a way of measuring brain activity. These kinds of things are really important because what we're trying to do is tie together what's going on in your brain that we can see, which is evidenced by the scan on the left side of the screen, and then what's going on in your mind. You know, like, what were you thinking at the time that I saw this part of your brain light up, right? What part of the problem were you on when I saw this part of your brain light up? And that's where we're going in the future, is trying to really tie together psychological, mental processes with biological functions that we can directly observe, so that we can maybe get a little bit away from inferring what's going on inside of your head to making it a little bit more directly observable by watching it in the brain. Now, I'm kind of being careful in the way I'm phrasing this because I really, really want to underscore that we're not there yet. No matter what you've seen on TV or in magazines or whatever, where they accompany a report with a brain scan and imply that we know that this area of the brain was more active during the task and therefore it must drive that behavior, we are not at that place yet. All we know is that in a scan, a particular part of your brain lit up more than it did when you weren't doing that activity. That doesn't mean that it was the important part of your brain doing the activity. It means that it was active while you were doing it. But it could be that it's the part that brought together the functions of a lot of parts of your brain, and that it was just the most heavily active because it was integrating all the information. We don't know what it means. So I always want to try and educate my intro to psych students to be really careful about reports that include brain scans or brain activity. We really aren't there yet as far as knowing what it means. But we'll talk about that as the quarter goes on. What exactly do we know versus what do we kind of hope we might know, or things that we're testing right now, things like that. Okay, well, this concludes our history of psychology in, I don't know how long this took me, but maybe, one normal class session's length of time. All right, I will talk to you guys later.